Okay, Year 12 Global Politics. Today we're going to be looking at the responses to terrorism. In terms of the key knowledge and the key skills for this, we need to be able to understand, obviously, these responses. And we're talking about global actors. So it doesn't just need to be states. We can be talking here about, institutions of global governance or TNCs as well. So it isn't just going to be states that we'll be looking at, and we will be looking at its effectiveness. In terms of the skills, we need to be able to explain the responses to terrorism and evaluate. So be able to say, what is effective and why that isn't an effective response to the crisis of terrorism. So this video is going to be a little long because there are quite a few different global actors that we have looked at. So get out some popcorn, and I hope you enjoy the discussion about responses to terrorism. So we'll start with the Philippines. To give you some background, they have faced a number of extreme terrorist organizations, and the biggest threat has been the AST, who have been linked to ISIS. And basically, in response to this threat, what had happened, well, I guess the initial threat was that the AST took control of the Marawi area, and they were waving the Islamic State flag and declared it as a caliphate. So there was a number of militants that arrived in this area. They were waving the flag, so the Filipino armed forces needed to respond. And they did. There was fighting between the military and the ASG. And then in October 2017, the group were defeated. It was quite dramatic as well because all the residents of this island were also forced to evacuate. So there was 85,000 residents that had to leave. Also, according to the armed forces, they believe that the Philippines will be rid of terrorist factions such as the AST by 2022. So there's been quite a lot of action in the Philippines in response to terrorism, and some has been effective. So obviously we have, with the threat of the AST in 2017, they had 60 days of fighting. There was a state of emergency, 85,000 residents were evacuated. And then in October 2017, the group was defeated. So this was an effective response because they did remove the threat of the AST. In July 2019, the government came up with a national action plan on preventing and countering violent extremism. So this plan was that they would work with leaders in religious organizations to mainstream their teachings and, help de-radicalize youths who were targets for recruitment. So they figured that the young people were being recruited, so we needed to de-radicalize them with the leaders. They also established a maximum security prison where they would hold, the terrorist threats, the ASG and the BIFF. The BIFF are an Islamic freedom fighter group. And, the fact that they've got so many, they have managed to arrest so many of these terrorists shows that it's been effective. However, it is overcrowded, so that can actually allow these prisoners to actually mingle with each other and help radicalize other people in the prison. So, it shows a good response because they're actually got all these people now in prison, but it's bad because it's also that these inmates can actually have an opportunity to talk with others and potentially radicalize. In 2020, the armed forces killed 7,000 rebels from the New People's Army. And in addition to that, they've killed a number of other terrorist group members, members from the ASG, the BIFF, and other terrorist organizations. So they have been able to eliminate some of this terrorist threat. because terrorism has been, a big issue within the Philippines, there has been discussion around what they will do about it, and the AFP have said that they should be able to resolve this threat by 2022. And in terms of progress, in December 2020, they said that the AFP were winning the war against terrorists. They had them now in prison. And, during that year, they did kill a number of terrorists. So in their minds, they did see that they were, winning this war. However, there are still pro-ISIS groups in the Philippines, and there still are, terrorist groups in the Philippines. They haven't eradicated terrorism. Thinking back to the Bernardo Island that had control of the ASG, after they defeated them in 2017, there was still about 100 foreign fighters in that area, so they weren't completely gone. Also, there has been radicalization in their maximum security prison. With it being overcrowded at 165%, that provides an opportunity for members of terrorist groups to actually meet and mingle with each other. So, that could actually work against the Philippines. Also, even though they've said, in 2020, we're winning the war, there was still a number of terrorist attacks in that time. Between 2018 and 2020, there were 5 suicide bombings. And one of them, which was more significant, was at Easter in the Jolo Cathedral, where it resulted in the death of 23 people. So, there is still a threat to, peace in the Philippines. There is still terrorism existing here. So, they haven't been completely effective in eliminating their country of terrorism. And also, by removing the threat, by killing members of these different terrorist groups, these counter-terrorism methods can actually create fear amongst local populations, and it can also then result in maybe acting as propaganda for these organizations to get people to rise up and fight with them. So yeah, that's really the Philippines' response. We also have here the Global Coalition Against Terrorism. This is an example of international cooperation, because it's involving 83 states, all working together to dismantle ISIS. So it was established in 2014 by Secretary of State John Kerry. His goal was that the focus would be on defeating the ideology, the funding and recruitment of ISIL or ISIS. And yeah, that was really the focus here. They focused their efforts on providing military support, stopping the flow of foreign fighters, stop financing and funding, addressing the humanitarian causes, and countering ISIL's propaganda. So they were really the main focus areas. And it's international cooperation because there's 83 states involved. So in terms of its effectiveness, well, in 2019, it was quite effective because, they were able, and they did actually defeat ISIS in Iraq and Syria. It was a major milestone. It was, a success of international cooperation because they did all work effectively to prevent ISIS from controlling these areas. As ISIS no longer controls those areas, it was a success for them. However, the threat of ISIS in Iraq and Syria has not been eliminated, and ISIS still exists in various cells across the world. There's groups that are associated with them. In in the Philippines, or in West Africa, there's ISIS groups. So they're not completely gone. In Iraq and Syria, there have been suicide attacks in 2021, showing that then the threat still exists. And, there are still, the US still believes that there are sleeper cells, that there are still ISIS groups out there who are wanting ISIS to, become and regain their control that they once had. So really here, we can probably say that ISIS have not been the global coalition against ISIS have not been fully effective in defeating ISIS, because the threat still continues. Speaking of the US and their involvement in the global coalition against terrorism, we also have their response to terrorism. This is again an example of international cooperation. They have Operation Inherent Resolve, which is a counter-terrorism strategy by the US and is a military campaign. So they worked with, local groups as well as, external, other countries to help defeat and try to defeat ISIS. So, in this campaign, they obviously, in 2019, were able to regain territory in Iraq and Syria. But to do so, with these counter-terrorism strategies, they did have to carry out airstrikes. So, and, in those airstrikes, civilians were killed. So there was still a human cost to it. Another response, this is a domestic response to terrorism, was the Executive Order 13708, titled Protecting the Nation from Foreign Terrorist Entry. Some of you may know of this as the Muslim ban. This was an executive order signed by Trump in 2017, which placed limits on travel to the US from countries that were associated with terrorists. And obviously, really the biggest, the background really here is with Operation Inherent Resolve was that they were able to actually defeat ISIS. And, they did actually kill the leader of ISIS in a US raid in northern Syria. So there's that as well. Okay, so in terms of how effective the US has been in responding to the crisis of terrorism, obviously we have Operation Inherent Resolve. It's a counter-terrorism strategy, and it did result in the US regaining territory. They did actually, defeat the caliphate, and, the 88,000 square kilometers that were taken by ISIS went back to Syria. However, through their counter-terrorism strategies, it did result in civilian deaths, and killing civilians can act as propaganda for Islamic State. So in that sense, they could have exacerbated the crisis. They could still, have actually made it, have actually maybe made some propaganda there for ISIS, and has helped fuel hate towards the West. But I've already now kind of started to get into the ineffectiveness of their response. It's good to still talk about more. There's still more that we could say. And ISIS is still a security threat in Syria and in Iraq. They still have territory in Homs and Damascus. And in those areas, ISIS is still there, and they are growing. In reports, there's been, 15 to 20,000, ISIS fighters still in that area. Trump has also cut off assistance in Syria, which could further destabilize that region and could lead to, in ISIS actually growing again. So, that's not very good there. Also, they, obviously they're still a security threat. They're still carrying out attacks. By August, 126 attacks by ISIS were committed across Syria, were reported for 2020. It was 144 in 2019. So, they're still out there. They're still a threat. And, the counter-terrorism strategies have, created fear and have created an anti-West sentiment being perpetuated there. Okay, so we have China's response. This is a unilateral response. So, because they are acting alone, and really to give you some background as to why they're carrying out these, their re-education camps and the three forces. So it really started when when there were attacks committed by the Uyghurs. So in 2013, a four-wheel drive plowed into a group of pedestrians near Tiananmen Square. The driver was identified as a Uyghur. Again, so, not a few months later, in March 2014, a knife-wielding terrorist attacked a group of people in a railway station. They killed 31 and injured 141. Xinjiang militants were blamed for the attack, and 380 people were arrested in the crackdown. An attacker and 3 others were charged, and they were sentenced to death, and 1 for life. Then again, a few months later, there were 2 suicide car bombings that occurred after the occupants threw explosives from their vehicles in a street market. It's killed 43 people and injured more than 90, the deadliest attack in the Xinjiang conflict. China responded harshly and sentenced those people to death. So there was an issue with terrorism, or, secession or extremism in this area. So China took action. In a white paper in 2013, they said the 3 forces were namely terrorism, separatism, and extremism, and they were on the rise. And they were right. There was 3 attacks in a year. So China decided to develop a counter-terrorism strategy, and they've responded by arresting hundreds of thousands of people. So between 2013 and 2017, and hundreds of thousands of people were arrested in Xinjiang. So all within this region. 7.3% of the arrests that took place in China were in Xinjiang. So it was quite a significant increase. They went from 80,000 to over 300,000 arrests. So they were targeting this region, namely because they did believe the Uyghur people were responsible for terrorism, separatism, and extremism. So they responded harshly. In March 2019, the Chinese officials said that they had arrested 13,000 militants in Xinjiang since 2014. That 13,000 is quite low. There's been hundreds of thousands. And even there's been reports more recently that there are, over 1 million people in these re-education camps. So since 2017, the Chinese government has been detaining the Uyghur people in re-education camps. More than 1 million people are being held here. They have no legal process. There's shocking conditions. There's torture. And these camps have been heavily criticised for suppressing this religious group, Muslim people, for political indoctrination and forced sterilisation and mistreatment of the people. So really, and it feels horrible after saying that this is an effective response to terrorism, but they have responded harshly to this threat of terrorism. In response to these attacks in this region, they have responded by arresting and really quashing hundreds of thousands, if not over 1 million people. So yeah, that's been their response to the threat of terrorism. And we also now have the United Nations. So the United Nations have been effective when it's been in the national interests of states to participate. So national interests really play a significant role in this, because if it isn't in states' national interests, then they're not going to do it. And if they're not going to do it, then they're going to veto it, and then nothing will happen. So it started really in August 2013, when there was reports of an attack in Damascus, when in a field, suburb really, there were reports of incidents of chemical attacks. So weapons investigators went in and had a look. They, on the 16th of September 2013, they published their report and did conclude that there were chemical weapons used in this attack. Then the UN Security Council met and they passed Resolution 2118 in relation to the framework for the elimination of chemical weapons during the Syrian civil war. So this was an effective response because, it was highlighting that they wanted to eliminate chemical weapons and that these chemical weapons were a threat to peace and security. And, it was a success because, there was no veto and states worked together. They all worked together to resolve this. And so it was an effective response. Part of this resolution was that Syria would have until the 30th of June 2014 to destroy its chemical weapons. And, to an extent, they were actually successful with this. They were successful for this. The Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, or OPCW, said that Syria in 2014 did meet its disarmament targets. They were to destroy their stockpiles, which they did. And in 2014, 92% of the chemical weapons had been removed or destroyed. However, so we can still say that this response wasn't completely effective. There were still 12 chemical weapon production sites. They did say that they would seal them. They were going to be unusable. But, the West were wary of this and did feel that they would still be able to use this later. And they did. There was a series of attacks that took place between 2014 and 2017. And action was taken again in February 2017. However, this time there was a different response. So this is an effective response because, in response to this issue, there was crisis diplomacy and they acted. And the action was taken. The Syrian government did, somewhat meet their disarmament targets. Okay. So, ineffective though. So, again, in 2017, there are reports of more chemical weapons attacks. So the United Nations Security Council create a resolution. So it was Resolution 172. It was proposed by France and the UK, and the resolution focused on sanctioning individuals and entities involved with chemical weapons production. Russia said that this was politically biased. and China called it a hypocrisy. So this shows that, that the UN Security Council was deadlocked and they weren't actually able to find a way to work together to resolve this crisis. They were deadlocked. The use of veto prevented a resolution. So we could also talk about that as a challenge, that, an issue when trying to resolve international crises is that international cooperation can sometimes fail and that states will veto resolutions, or that the Security Council will be deadlocked. So since 2013, the Council have passed 26 resolutions on humanitarian access, peace talks and chemical weapons in Syria. Russia and China have vetoed 10 draft UN Security Council resolutions, and Russia has independently voted on or vetoed an additional 6. So, for Russia, they have an ally in Syria. It's one of their major allies, if not their only ally in the Middle East. So it's in their national interests to continue to support the Assad regime, even if that means, preventing the United Nations from achieving peace and security. And for China, their national interest is that they believe in state sovereignty. They don't believe that the international community should be involved in involved in conflicts that don't concern them. They believe that states should just, internal disputes should just remain internal and that the international community shouldn't be involved. So, we have national interests here that can prevent responses from being effective. Also, the Human Rights Council have adopted 35 resolutions condemning atrocities in Syria, but we haven't really seen much. All they're doing here is just condemning atrocities. In going back to kind of this, the Security Council, the UN Special Envoy for Syria has said that Russia and China just need to find a way to work together, that the chemical weapons attacks, there's people involved, it's dangerous for these people, and we just need to come up with a way to resolve it where states aren't going to veto it. It's not going to be declared as politically biased, that they just come up with a solution. But unfortunately, national interests and veto do prevent international cooperation from occurring. So, in summary, we have discussed different responses. And really, our focus here is on saying how effective they have been in achieving, and in, achieving or undermining the threat of terrorism, So really think about that. Has terrorism been eradicated because of their responses? And in most circumstances, no. The threat of ISIS continues. And, it still is going to continue because of globalization and because, international cooperation has failed. On that note, on that bright and happy note, we have now finished responses to terrorism. I hope that was helpful. I hope that helped you understand them a little bit more. If you have any questions, sing out, and thank you for listening.